And now, freshly back from his DrupalCon Barcelona experience, and to talk about our module of the week, let's turn it over to Martin Anderson Klutz, a senior solutions engineer at Acquia and a maintainer of a number of Drupal modules and recipes of his own. Martin, what do you have for us this week?
Thanks, John. Have you ever wanted an admin UI to manage sets of configuration to version and share across Drupal sites? There's a module for that. It's called Features, and it was created in March of 2009 by user Yhan, though recent releases are by Dave Reed. Now it has 7.x-2.15 and 8.x-3.14 versions available, the latter of which works with Drupal 9.4 and 10. Now it is marked as minimally maintained, but it does have security coverage and test coverage. And for documentation, it has a documentation guide and probably has hundreds, if not thousands, of tutorials available. It does have 610 open issues, 54 of which are bugs against the 8.x branch, which is not bad considering it's in use by almost 117,000 sites, though the majority of those are using the D7 version. Now, many listeners will remember Features as the de facto solution for configuration management in Drupal 7 and earlier. As the name implies, it was originally intended to share common capabilities across different Drupal sites. And unlike recipes, Features can have version numbers because there is a path to sync configuration updates across sites using a feature, though this is where a lot of teams found Features could be complex to use. Now, we did previously cover Features as module of the week all the way back in episode number 147, but I thought it was relevant to today's discussion because of the way it provides a UI for organizing and exporting specific sets of configuration. There is an open issue for Features to directly export recipes because it already does a lot of the time-consuming work of collecting together necessary config files, including dependencies. But even in its current state, it could be a time saver for anyone wanting to start creating their own recipes. So let's talk about Features.
So, features. I'm not a huge lover of features, but Nick is. So, I'm wondering, like, how many? Well, let me ask this: How many people on the panel are actually using features currently?
S- So, leading up to today's call, I installed Features for the first time in probably more than 5 years.
Okay. And like recipes kind of tie it together, right? Feels like a bit of a replacement for features, right? Like, yeah, Martin's shaking his head
Nodding, yes.
vigorously, nodding his head vigorously to that, right? So like, and I've heard, and I don't know this to be 100% accurate, but like features could at some point in a future life iteration be like a recipes exporter, maybe of some sort. Is that fair to say? Maybe.
So that's where there is that issue in the issue queue of Features that sort of proposes that idea. There was a comment from one of the maintainers saying, you could decorate the specific class that, I think is responsible for the structure of how it gets exported. But notionally, if you look at the way Features creates today by default, basically a module, it has sort of that, config install set of configuration files that
Mhm.
are your configuration YAML, which effectively are the same thing that you would sort of, potentially manually collect together as part of creating a recipe. And, I know for myself, that's how I've tended to create them to date, is going through that manual process of picking a couple things that I know that I need, maybe seeing what things they need and picking those, out one by one. And then, typically testing it, realizing that there are a couple that I missed, and then having to sort of root for those and pull them in. Whereas the potential of using something like Features is that it figures out that sort of tree of dependencies for you and collects those all together, and then also gives you a UI where you can manage those. And then that way, if you go back to update your recipe, you can sort of make all of the configuration changes through the UI, export those again, and then you have all of your updated configuration again in one place. That makes it easy to put into your recipe.
I think features was one of the standout modules of Drupal 7, right? It's the module that made managing a moderately complex site possible. It was the
Did
only
did
way to like
did
make changes on
everybody
your local, export them.
sorry, did everybody here use features with Drupal 7?
Yep,
Yeah,
I have.
Yes.
everybody's shaking
Yep.
their head. So I'm literally the outlier that like avoided it like the plague. Got it. Okay, sorry, Nick, continue.
Yeah, I don't know how you managed any moderately complex sites without using features. I mean, it was the only way to get config up. Now, features does do one thing that recipes doesn't really do out of the box. Well, I'm going to say out of the box, but you can do it with some workarounds. Like features doesn't isn't just about adding a feature to a site. It's also about maintaining a feature. So if you have modifications,
Mhm.
it will do its best to make the upstream site match whatever's in the feature. Whereas recipes, if you just put config into the config folder, it will try to add that stuff, but if it already exists, it's going to throw an error. So if you want to modify existing configuration, you need to use an action. And features doesn't really know what config actions are yet. So I think um the recipe generation aspect of whatever recipe generator the community ends up on, it kind of needs two or three pieces to it. One of those is how do you collect all the config for a particular piece and just export that. Ideally, the second piece would be some sort of knowledge about what config actions are available and a way to assign things to a config action. Um, and then, how do you go about testing the recipes? Now, to be fair, we don't have any of that right now. And even just
Mhm.
collecting the correct configuration can be painful. And I think recipes already helps with that. I also want to point out, I think ECA has similar functionality, although it's not fully fleshed out. Like I know Jurgen has a way to export config for a particular ECA script or ECA flow so that he can debug things. And it kind of does a similar, like it gathers all the relevant config and exports it as a zip. So there's multiple ways to do that, but features, yeah, features was indispensable. Even just I would always use the diff module too, because you could see, what was different between your feature and whatever site you were trying to import it on.
Martin, question for you on one fact that I'm reading here. Usage, 117,000 sites are using it. Majority of those are D7. Do we think that features use is going to go way down after D7 end of life and after folks move off of, D7 for different versions of Drupal?
I think it's definitely accurate to say that, to the extent that people migrate away from Drupal 7, there's likely to be a corresponding drop in
Hmm.
the overall usage of features. But that being said, I think it's a bit of an open question of how quickly that drop will happen. So, that's definitely something to keep an eye on for next year.
Interesting.
I think one thing that's interesting too is that features currently has more sites on Drupal 5 using it than Drupal 6, which it's not often you see a module that still has usage statistics for Drupal 5, but I think it's kind
I'd,
of funny.
I'd like to meet the person running that Drupal 5 site. Like I feel like that's a labor of love there.
I think I remember seeing that there was actually a release for Drupal 5 of features not that long ago, but
Interesting.
yeah.
All right.
I'd like to add some clarity about the features involvement with recipes.
Oh, feel free.
That
Feel free.
this issue that Martin mentioned was opened in August of 2022 by Mr. Nedjo, who was kind of like the grandfather of recipes. He's since retired from Drupal development, but a lot of the groundwork was laid with him and Alex Pott. Dave Reed, one of the maintainers, added a "Is features still needed? What a 4.x branch might look like" link to the issue. And then, yeah, Martin and Andy Post have been discussing the possibilities. I think the big risk now is that with recipes as experimental in Drupal core, they can still change.
Mhm.
So we are following a deprecation style workflow. if things are changed. Uh, but you know, like any builders or things that extend recipes run the risk of basically the foundation of recipes being changed underneath them. So that's
Yeah.
why, like at this time, we're not really endorsing any recipe generators. But if one
Yeah.
were to explore this avenue, features and what Jurgen has done in the ECA export module are great places for prior art, to look at and
Mhm.
discover and build upon.
Yeah, and if I'm being honest, one thing that Drupal always struggles with is naming. I think features is one of the better named modules in the Drupal world. It would be kind of ironic if it became a recipe generator, and by that token became a terribly named module. Became that doesn't do what it says it does.
Well,
Maybe
so
it makes sense to credit.
I was just gonna say, is there a process for in the Drupal community for changing the name of your module? Like,
No,
did he? We
no,
don't.
you
It's
can't.
basically shut it down and start a new one, right?
Yeah, you can't
Yeah,
change your
well, for
machine
the
name.
machine name anyway. Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah, so it makes sense to create a new recipe generator module or project or something more general because it's more of a well, features is a developer tool too, but it becomes much more of a local developer tool than something that you would have installed on websites and use. But we can certainly take inspiration either way um, from how features kind of gathers, the UI and how it gathers the config dependencies.
So we're kind of like, I don't know, we're future visioning features here, right? But I'm wondering like if there's a state where features kind of follows the same sort of idea as like Search API or the new AI, API in Drupal, right? Where it's like features core is like more of an API layer, and people can build plugins to do different things. And one of those plugins is kind of like, legacy features or like how features worked, previously. And then maybe one of them is like a recipe type exporter builder sort of submodule. I don't know. But anyway. Um
Yeah.
so it sounds like we'll have to revisit this in like 6 months to a year, when recipes has more, maybe is less experimental, and maybe then there'll be another version of features that we can talk about. But for the time being, it sounds like you can use features as you have in the past, and export things into modules and import them into other sites if that's the road you want to go down. Um, as always, Martin, thank you for bringing us another module of the week that is on topic and has provided us with an enlightening conversation. If folks wanted to suggest a module of the week, or just chat about this one, where could they do that?
Always happy to talk about modules of the week in the Talking Drupal channel of Drupal Slack, or folks can reach out to me directly as ManClue on all of the Drupal and social platforms.